Imagine kneeling in the shadowed hush of an ancient church, your fingers prying open a rusted lock that's guarded unholy secrets for nearly a century. As the lid creaks like a grave exhaling, a spectral chill grips your soul, whispers of divine judgment, buried sins, and a plantation's blood-stained redemption clawing back from the abyss. What if God's justice never forgets? In the suffocating embrace of a Louisiana summer, where the air clings like a shroud of unspoken sins, St. Gideon's church stood as a weary sentinel amid the whispering pecan groves. Its white-clapboard walls, cracked and peeling like old parchment skin, absorbed the relentless sun, casting long, jagged shadows that danced with the ghosts of forgotten prayers. The steeple, a modest finger pointing toward an indifferent heaven, pierced the hazy sky, where thunderheads gathered like divine accusations, heavy with the promise of judgment yet to fall. This was no ordinary house of worship, it was a vessel of time, its foundations sunk deep into soil stained by the sweat and blood of generations, where the line between salvation and damnation blurred like mist over the Mississippi. The year was 1948, a time when the world outside buzzed with the clamor of post-war reinvention, factories humming, cities expanding, ideologies clashing like storm fronts. But in Ascension Parish, time moved like molasses dripping from the sugar mills, thick and unyielding. The Mississippi River, that ancient serpent of mud and memory, slithered through the flatlands, its waters carrying the faint echoes of paddle wheels long silenced and the muffled cries of those who had toiled on its banks. Sugarcane fields stretched endlessly, their tall stalks swaying in hypnotic rhythm, whispering secrets to the wind. The air was a living thing, saturated with the earthy tang of fertile loam, the sharp bite of fermenting cane, and the floral decay of magnolias wilting under the heat. Spanish moss hung from the gnarled arms of live oaks like tattered veils of mourning, filtering sunlight into dappled patterns that played tricks on the eye, turning ordinary paths into labyrinths of light and shadow. This South was a tapestry woven from threads of resilience and regret, where the scars of the Antebellum era festered beneath a veneer of progress. Plantation mansions dotted the landscape, some still proud with their colonnaded facades, others crumbling under the assault of vines and humidity, their verandas sagging like weary shoulders bearing the weight of inherited guilt. The social order, though cracking at the edges with whispers of change, clung to hierarchies forged in iron chains and cotton profits. Race, class, and the unspoken pacts of power formed an invisible web, binding families in a dance of denial and dominance. Here, history wasn't a distant echo, it was a palpable presence, a spiritual undercurrent that infused every breath, every glance, every sermon delivered from the pulpit. At the core of this world pulsed St. Gideon's, a Baptist bastion for the white congregation whose bloodlines traced back to the river's earliest settlers. Built in 1850 on what was once the heart of the Voclain Plantation, a sprawling empire of sugar and suffering, the church exuded an aura of eternal vigilance. Its simple stained glass windows, depicting scenes of biblical redemption, Adam's fall, Christ's sacrifice, the promise of grace, filtered sunlight into kaleidoscopes of crimson and gold, bathing the pews in a light that felt both holy and haunting. The wooden floors creaked underfoot like confessions unwillingly given, and the air inside carried the faint incense of polished oak, candle wax, and the musty breath of old hymnals. For nearly a century, it had been a refuge, a place where souls sought absolution from the mundane sins of daily life, oblivious to the deeper darkness embedded in its very stones. Yet beneath the sanctity, the ground hummed with unrest, as if the earth itself remembered the injustices sown into it, awaiting a reckoning from a higher power. Into this charged atmosphere stepped Elias Thorne Roy Drain in the old tales, but reimagined here as a man whose name evoked thorns of trial and divine testing. At 28, Elias carried the weight of the Pacific War in his sinewy frame and shadowed eyes. His hands, roughened by years of wielding hammers and saws, bore the calluses of a carpenter who had rebuilt not just structures, but fragments of his shattered spirit. The jungles of Guadalcanal had taught him the fragility of life, how a single bullet could unravel a man's fate, how silence after artillery fire felt like God's own pause for judgment. He returned home not as the boy who left, but as a vessel of quiet resolve, his faith tempered by the fires of hell on earth. Practical to his core, Elias viewed the world through the lens of structure and stability, assessing beams for rot, walls for cracks, lives for hidden weaknesses. He believed in the tangible, wood that could be mended, stone that could be fortified, yet deep down, a spiritual hunger gnawed at him, a quest for meaning beyond the material. The church elders, sensing his steadfast demeanor, enlisted him for the renovation. St. Gideon's groaned under the burdens of age, roof tiles slipping like lost souls, wiring frayed like nerves on the edge of breaking, and the sacristy, a dim antechamber off the altar, damp with neglect, its walls weeping condensation like tears of remorse. Elias arrived with his weathered toolbox, rolls of blueprints unfurled like sacred scrolls, and a mindset honed for efficiency. He had no patience for folklore or phantoms, his was a mission of restoration, not revelation. Little did he know that the church, in its divine irony, would strip away his illusions, exposing him to a truth that mirrored the biblical parable of hidden treasures, fields bought for pearls of great price, but laced with thorns of moral reckoning. His initial days blurred into a rhythm of labor, scraping away layers of decay, reinforcing sagging joists, and sifting through the sacristy's forgotten relics. The room was a crypt of ecclesiastical debris, faded vestments hanging like spectral robes, stacks of brittle bulletins yellowed like ancient manuscripts. Silver chalices tarnished by time's indifferent touch. Dust motes swirled in the slanted light from a single high window, creating ethereal halos that mocked the sanctity below. It was here, in the farthest corner where shadows pooled like spilled ink, that Elias first encountered the chest. Unassuming at first glance a rectangular cedar box, its grain darkened to near black by decades of seclusion, it exuded an inexplicable gravity. The surface bore faint scars from crude tools, as if hewn in haste or secrecy, and a massive iron lock, encrusted with rust like dried blood, barred entry. It wasn't merely furniture, it felt like a tabernacle of taboo, a sealed ark containing covenants best left unbroken. Elias attempted to shift it, muscles straining against its unexpected heft, but it resisted, anchored as if by spectral hands. A faint scent of aged cedar wafted up, mingled with something deeper, earth, decay, and a whisper of sanctity violated. He dismissed it initially, prioritizing the practical, patching leaks, rewiring hazards. But curiosity, that serpent in the garden of the mind, coiled tighter with each passing hour. Whispers from the elders echoed in his thoughts, vague legends of a forbidden coffer placed in the sacristy during reconstruction, meant to safeguard sensitive annals from prying eyes. Elias chalked it up to rural myth-making, the kind that romanticized rot into romance. Yet as he worked, the chest loomed in his periphery, its silence a challenge to his pragmatism, stirring a spiritual unease he couldn't name. The day of unveiling broke with oppressive heat, the sky a bruised canvas of impending storm. Humidity wrapped around Elias like a confessor's cloak, beads of sweat tracing paths down his neck as he labored in the sacristy. The only sounds were the rasp of his tools against wood and the distant drone of cicadas, a chorus that felt like nature's lament for buried wrongs. Having cleared the clutter, he turned his full attention to the chest. Larger than anticipated, nearly 4 feet long, 2 wide, and deep enough to swallow secrets, it rested on the floor like a coffin awaiting exhumation. He knelt before it, the cool wood floor pressing against his knees like a call to prayer. Running his fingers over the lid, he felt the texture, rough-hewn planks, nails hammered with purposeful force. The lock, a brutish relic of wrought iron, stared back with its keyhole clogged by time's debris. A premonition flickered, a biblical echo of Pandora's box, or perhaps the sealed scrolls of Revelation, holding judgments for the end times. Elias's practical side rebelled against the hesitation. He fetched a chisel and mallet, working methodically at the lock's edges. Metal screeched in protest, a wail that reverberated through the empty church like a soul's cry for mercy. Flakes of rust fell like autumn leaves, and with a final, resonant crack, the mechanism yielded. The lid lifted with a groan of hinges long dormant, releasing a gust of antiquity, musty paper, desiccated herbs, and an undercurrent of something primal, regret, perhaps, or the faint metallic tang of blood long dried. Elias peered inside, his breath catching in a moment of sacred pause. The contents were arranged with eerie precision, as if curated by a hand guided by fate or folly. Atop lay a hefty leather-bound ledger, its cover embossed with faint initials AV cracked like parched earth. Beneath, a sealed envelope of heavy vellum, its wax seal imprinted with a crest resembling intertwined vines or chains. Rolled nearby was a parchment document, bound by a frayed silk cord, its edges curled like withered leaves. A hand-sketched map on coarse linen depicted winding paths through fields and forests, marked with cryptic symbols, crosses, perhaps graves. And in a corner, swaddled in faded muslin, a delicate artifact, an ivory haircomb, intricately carved with floral motifs, its tines sharp as accusations. Elias's hands trembled as he lifted the ledger, its weight a burden on his soul. Opening it, pages crackled like breaking seals, revealing meticulous script, elegant loops and flourishes that belied the horror within. Names leaped out, Nora, aged 19, valued at $700, intelligent, deny access to scripture, lest rebellion stir. Dade, 14, $600, malleable spirit, watch for signs of unrest. Clara, 28, $1,200, devoted mother, her offspring promise strong labor. Henry, 35, $1,500, skilled artisan, twice fled, now humbled by the rod. Each entry was a ledger of lives commodified, yet marginal notes revealed a tormentor's conscience. Their eyes accuse me in dreams, must they not see God's order in this? It was a plantation's grim Bible, chronicling the Voclain estate's enslaved souls from 1839 to 1857, infused with undertones of spiritual warfare, sin justified as divine hierarchy, guilt simmering like brimstone. A sharp knock shattered the trance. Reverend Harlan Voss, Reverend Arzino and faded lore, but here a frail vessel of 79, his white hair a halo of unwitting complicity, poked his head in. His eyes, behind wire-rimmed spectacles, held the gentle spark of a shepherd long accustomed to guiding flocks through pastures of platitudes. Elias, son? Sounded like the devil himself was wrestling in here. His voice, warm with southern drawl, carried no inkling of the abyss yawning open. Elias turned, ledger clutched like a forbidden gospel, his face drained of color, eyes wide with the dawn of revelation. Reverend, this ain't just old papers. It's Judgment Day in a box. He gestured to the open chest, artifacts bathed in the window's ethereal glow, casting shadows that twisted like tormented spirits. Voss approached, his steps faltering as comprehension dawned. His hand hovered, then withdrew, as if touching would invoke a curse. The old coffer, sealed by decree, they said. Never to tempt the Lord's wrath. Color fled his cheeks, leaving him ghostly, his frame quaking like a reed in the wind. In that moment, the church's foundation seemed to shift, not physically, but spiritually, a chasm opening where faith once stood firm. The air thickened with the weight of divine retribution, sins of forefathers rising like vapors from cracked earth. As they poured over the ledger together, each page a verse in a lamentation psalm, the entries deepened the dread. Bess, 22, $900, fleet of foot, finds well to kin, used to quell unrest. Tom, her brother, noted with a chilling addendum, whipped for insolence, his gaze holds fire extinguished before it spreads. Aldous Voclain's hand, so precise, wove a narrative of control masked as providence, his notes laced with biblical allusions, as the Lord divides the wheat from chaff, so must we steward our charges. Yet cracks appeared, confessions of nightmares where the enslaved rose as avenging angels, their chains turned to swords of justice. The room grew colder, though the sun blazed outside. Elias felt a spiritual stirring, as if the chest's opening had unleashed not just history, but a haunting legacy, a reminder that sin's unrepented echo through eternity, demanding redemption or ruin. Voss murmured a prayer, his voice breaking, Lord, forgive us our trespasses, as we unearth those of our kin. The storm outside finally broke, rain lashing the windows like tears from heaven, underscoring the inescapable truth, in the heart of sanctity, darkness dwelled, awaiting its hour. But the revelations were only beginning. The sealed letter beckoned, its wax seal cracking under Elias's thumb like the breaking of a covenant. Inside, Voclain's words poured forth, a confession penned in trembling script, to whomsoever finds this, know that I, Aldous Voclain, have borne the mark of Cain upon my soul. The plantation's prosperity is built on stolen lives, and in my final days, visions plague me, specters of those I owned, crying for justice from the Almighty. He detailed a hidden atrocity, a rebellion quashed. In 1857, bodies buried in unmarked graves mapped on the linen sketch, their spirits unrestful until truth prevailed. The haircomb, once a mere trinket, now symbolized fractured innocence, belonging to Nora, whose entry noted her beauty that tempts, must be veiled. Elias imagined her, young, resilient, her spirit unbroken despite the chains, her comb a token of fleeting dignity in a world of degradation. Psychological depths emerged, Voclain's ledger not just accounts, but a diary of descent into madness, where ownership warped into obsession, sin into self-justification. As thunder rolled, mirroring the turmoil within, Elias and Voss grappled with the implications. This wasn't mere history, it was a spiritual indictment, themes of guilt and redemption threading through like biblical vines. The church, built on plantation land, now stood as a monument to hypocrisy, preaching grace while rooted in exploitation. Empathy swelled for the named souls, dread for the living descendants whose lineages intertwined with this shame. Curiosity burned. What further horrors lay in the parchment document, a deed perhaps transferring land stained by blood? The narrative tightened, pacing like a heartbeat accelerating toward climax, short breaths of revelation punctuated by pauses of reflection. The sensory assault intensified, the ledger's ink sent sharp as accusation, the comb's bone smooth yet chilling, the map's fabric rough like grave dirt. Spiritually, it chilled to the core, divine justice not abstract, but imminent, haunting legacies that demanded confrontation. In this rewritten dawn, the chest's opening was an accident, it was providence, a call to atone in a world where the past's shadows lengthened eternally. The ledger lay open on the scarred oak table like an accusation carved in ink. Elias Thorne's finger traced the final entries, each name a wound reopened after decades of deliberate forgetting. The handwriting remained impeccable, loops and flourishes so refined they could have graced a family Bible, yet the words they formed were profane in their detachment. Tom, age 20 in 1840. Value, $950. Field hand. Exceptionally strong. Watch his gaze too closely. The underline beneath gaze was deliberate, a silent command etched by a man who understood that rebellion often begins in the eyes. Little May, age 3 in 1845. Value, $300. Daughter of Clara. Frail. That single word, frail, landed like a crack in marble. Amid columns of cold arithmetic, it flickered with something almost human, a fleeting acknowledgement that this child, priced lower than a good plow mule, might not survive the next harvest fever. Yet the valuation stood unchanged. Concern, if it existed, never interfered with commerce. Edmund, age 40 in 1850. Value, $1,000. Overseer's assistant. Loyal. Has informed on others. Elias paused. The word informed carried no condemnation in Voclain's script, only quiet approval. A man had traded the trust of his own people for favor, for perhaps an extra ration, a lighter lash, or the hollow promise of eventual freedom. The ledger did not judge, it rewarded. Ruth, age 17 in 1850. Value, $800. House servant. Quiet. Skilled seamstress. Amos, age 25 in 1852. Value, $1,300. Blacksmith. Valuable skill. Resentful. The word resentful was underlined twice, the ink darker, as though the pen had borne down harder, sensing danger. Patience, age 30 in 1855. Value, $1,400. Wet nurse. Good with white infants. Has lost 2 of her own. Elias's throat tightened. The sentence was appended casually, an afterthought in the inventory of assets. 2 children dead, cause unrecorded, grief unremarked, yet Patience continued to cradle the master's babies at her breast. The ledger noted her utility, never her mourning. George and Will, brothers, field hands, strong, always together. Florence, age 20 in 1855. Value, $750. Good with children. Quiet. Will not cause trouble. Reverend Voss slumped into the cane-bottomed chair, hands covering his face as though he could block out the light that now exposed everything. The elegant penmanship mocked him. Aldous Voclain had not been an ignorant brute. He had known these people, their strengths, their sorrows, their family ties, their secret fires. He had seen their humanity clearly enough to fear it, and still reduced them to line items. The ledger was more than a financial record, it was a confession of will blindness, a man convincing himself that precision could sanctify cruelty. The silence in the sacristy thickened until it felt like water closing over their heads. Elias reached for the sealed letter next. The red wax, imprinted with a stylized vine that now resembled a noose of thorns, cracked under his thumbnail with a sound like breaking bone. The paper inside was thick vellum, cream turning to ivory at the edges, folded with care. When he unfolded it, the scent of old lavender, faint, defiant, drifted upward, as though Nora had pressed a sprig between the pages before entrusting her words to darkness. He read in a low, reverent voice, giving her the dignity the ledger had stolen. To whoever finds this chest. My name is Nora. I came into this world around 1820 on the Voclain land beside the great river. My mother was Clara, sent to the fields before dawn and called back after dark. My father I never knew, perhaps he was sold south before I could remember his face, or perhaps he was never permitted to claim me. Our lives belonged to another. Yet the mind is a territory no chain can fully enclose. I learned letters by theft. The Voclain children took lessons beneath the live oak on the veranda. I carried lemonade and swept the gallery nearby. I watched the governess shape the alphabet in a tray of sand. I listened to the cadence of recitation. At night, by the stolen stub of a candle, I scratched shapes into the dirt floor of the quarters. Later I salvaged scraps of wrapping paper, practiced the master's own script, those same elegant curves he used to price our bodies. Knowledge became my quiet rebellion. Over years, a silent fellowship grew among us. We spoke in glances, in the rhythm of work songs, in the placement of a tool left just so. The Mississippi flowed past our fields, not only a barrier, but a highway of possibility. Whispers reached us of the railroad that ran by night, of safe houses beyond the Mason-Dixon line. Escape was not reckless dream, it demanded patience sharper than any blade. I became the keeper of patterns. In the quilts we stitched for the big house, I wove messages, a certain knot for weight, a red thread crossing blue for 3 nights hence, a particular flower motif marking the meeting place. Our overseers admired the handiwork and never suspected the code living inside it. 14 of us bound ourselves to the plan. We prepared through 10 long years. Dried corn, a file, a small knife, shoes wrapped in burlap to muffle steps. The chosen night, August 14, 1857. New moon. Heavy air. Rain promised but holding back, as though heaven itself waited to see what we would dare. We slipped from the quarters like shadows separating from shadow. Clara, my mother, walked beside me, her hand brushing mine once, the only farewell we dared. Henry the carpenter carried the weight of his tools in silence. Bess and Tom moved hand in hand, their steps matched. Patience carried the memory of her lost ones like hidden wounds. Dade walked at the rear, eyes scanning the dark. We reached the riverbank. A flatboat waited, pulled by a free man of color whose face we never clearly saw. Hope rose so fiercely it hurt. One by one we stepped aboard, the hull rocking gently. Then the dogs. Lanterns flaring like hellfire. Shouts splitting the night. Whip cracks. Gunshots. We scattered. Some ran into the cane. Others fought fists, sticks, desperation. I saw Clara fall, struck down. I saw Henry dragged back by his collar. I saw Dade standing apart, face illuminated, eyes wide with something between guilt and grief. By dawn I alone remained uncaught, or so they let me believe. They kept me apart. Not in the quarters, but in a small room above the carriage house. Watched. Always watched. Master Aldous had discovered my reading. He did not kill me. He studied me, as one studies an interesting specimen. Perhaps he believed he could break what he could not own outright. I do not hate Dade. He was offered manumission papers, freedom, for names. He was promised what every soul in bondage craves. I judge instead the man who forced the choice, who dangled liberty like bait before betrayal. I have placed this letter here with the ledger, the map of the burial ground where they laid our dead that August morning, and my mother's bone comb, the only thing of hers I could keep. If you read this, you have opened what he sealed. He thought silence would last forever. He was wrong. Truth moves like the river, it may be dammed, diverted, poisoned, but it rises. It floods. It finds the sea. I have done what one woman could. The rest is yours. Nora, who was here. Elias's voice cracked on the final line. He set the letter down as though it might burn him. Reverend Voss wept openly now, shoulders shaking. The gentle shepherd who had baptized 3 generations suddenly looked ancient, hollowed out. She wrote without rage, he whispered. Only clarity. That's what terrifies me most. Elias turned to the parchment scroll, its ribbon disintegrating at his touch. He unrolled it slowly. A church covenant, dated October 12, 1857, scarcely 8 weeks after the Riverbank slaughter. We, the undersigned deacons and elders of St. Gideon's Baptist Church, in the name of Christian charity and the preservation of peace within our parish, do solemnly covenant that the unfortunate disturbance of August 14 to 15, 1857, on the Voclain Plantation shall remain known only among ourselves. That no record shall be made in civil courts nor public discourse. That the spiritual care of all souls involved shall continue under the guidance of this congregation alone. That silence is the price of continued prosperity and communal harmony. May the Lord grant us wisdom to heal what division has wrought. Below, 11 signatures, each stroke deliberate, each name a pillar of Ascension Parish Society. Aldous Voclain, Thomas Du Bois, Elias Albright, Samuel Miller, Joseph Fontaneau, Caleb Bayou, Daniel Landry, Matthew Hebert, Paul Broussard, Pierre Thibodeau, William Thorne. Reverend Voss read the last name and recoiled as though struck. Thorne, he breathed. William Thorne, your great-great-grandfather, Elias. The room seemed to tilt. Elias stared at his own hands, the same hands that had opened the chest, as though they belonged to a stranger. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving only dripping eaves and the low, mournful call of a mourning dove. Inside the sacristy, however, a different tempest had only begun. The covenant was not mere cowardice. It was theology weaponized, sin reframed as necessary discretion, murder recast as unfortunate disturbance, justice postponed indefinitely for the sake of harmony. 11 men and Sunday school teachers, hymn leaders, men who had broken bread at this very altar, had sworn to bury the truth beneath prayers and platitudes. Elias felt something fracture inside himself. Not anger, exactly, something colder, deeper. Recognition. The same blood that ran in his veins had signed that parchment. The church he had come to repair had been built, stone by stone, on concealment. Nora's letter lay between them like an open wound. Her composure was more devastating than any scream. She had not cursed her captors, she had simply told the truth, and trusted that truth, given time, would outlive every lie built to contain it. The map remained unrolled. Faded ink lines traced cane rows, river bends, and a cluster of small crosses near an oxbow lake. Unmarked graves. 14 souls, if the ledger's final tally was accurate. Their bones still waited beneath Louisiana soil, patient as the river itself. Reverend Voss lifted his head, eyes red-rimmed but resolute. "We cannot leave this here," he said quietly. "Not anymore." Elias nodded once. The chest had been opened. Now the real work, the spiritual excavation, must begin. The covenant lay unfurled across Margaret Ter's kitchen table like a guilty verdict rendered in elegant copperplate. 11 signatures, once proud declarations of faith and fellowship, now read as a conspiracy sealed in ink and sanctified by prayer. The church elders of St. Gideon's had not merely witnessed the aftermath of August 1857, they had sworn to entomb it. No sheriff's inquest. No coroner's report. No public record of the Riverbank executions. Only silence, blessed and enforced in the name of communal harmony. Elias stood beside Margaret, arms folded tightly across his chest as though bracing against an invisible wind. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains, painting bars of light across the documents, turning the parchment golden while the truth beneath remained cold and shadowed. Margaret's gaze shifted to the last item still resting in the open cedar chest, the hand-drawn map on heavy, yellowed linen. She lifted it with both hands, as reverently as one might handle a funeral shroud. The fabric was coarse, probably salvaged from a feed sack or discarded sailcloth, yet the ink lines, faded to sepia, remained crisp enough to read after nearly a century. The map showed a narrow slice of the Voclain Plantation hugging the Mississippi's western bend. A lazy curve of river, a tight cluster of cypress knees rising like black sentinels from the water, a thin dotted path snaking from the slave quarters toward the bank. And then, spaced irregularly along that final stretch of shoreline, 14 tiny crosses. Each cross was no larger than a fingernail, yet together they formed a constellation of atrocity. 14, Elias said, his voice stripped to a flat monotone. He pointed without touching the linen. Nora wrote that 14 set out. She was the only one they brought back to the quarters alive. Margaret's breath hitched almost imperceptibly, but Elias heard it. She traced one cross with the tip of her smallest finger, stopping just short of the faded ink. "Not buried in the churchyard," she murmured. "Not under any stone with a name or a date. Just here. In the mud where the river rises every spring. Unmarked. Unconsecrated." The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon Elias had ever endured. Outside, children laughed somewhere down the dirt lane, a mockingbird ran through its repertoire in the pecan tree. Inside the small kitchen, time seemed to compress until 1857 and 1948 occupied the same anguished breath. Reverend Voss had remained behind at the church, too shattered to face this next step. Elias understood. The old man had spent 40 years preaching redemption from that pulpit, now the ground beneath it felt poisoned. But Elias had seen too much death in the Pacific to leave any bodies, unaccounted for. War had taught him that forgetting was its own kind of violence. That was why he had driven straight to Margaret Ter's house with the chest rotting in the bed of his truck like contraband. Margaret Ter was 48, a schoolteacher whose classroom smelled faintly of chalk dust, lemon oil, and the quiet determination of children who knew the world would not hand them anything. She wore her hair in a neat chignon, her dresses always pressed, her speech measured. Yet beneath the composure lay a mind that had spent years piecing together fragments of erased history, oral accounts from elders, scraps of Freedmen's Bureau records, songs half remembered in the fields. She had never been inside St. Gideon's, never sat in its pews, but she knew its shadow stretched long across the parish. When Elias first explained why he had come, she listened without interruption. When he set the chest on her kitchen floor and began lifting out the documents, she did not flinch. She simply watched, absorbing each object as though it were evidence in a trial that had been adjourned for 90 years. Now, holding the map, she spoke again. "Florence," she said. Elias looked up sharply. Margaret's eyes never left the linen. "My grandmother. Florence. Age 20 in 1855. Value $750. Good with children. Quiet. Will not cause trouble." She recited the ledger entry without consulting the page, as though the words had already burned themselves into her memory. "My mother used to say her mama was the gentlest soul she ever knew. Always humming hymns while she braided hair, always slipping extra cornbread to the little ones. But there was a sadness in her eyes my mother could never explain. A quiet that went deeper than shyness." Margaret set the map down with exquisite care. "She was one of the 14, she said. And she survived. She came home. She raised my mother. She helped raise me. And every day she carried this inside her." She touched the map lightly and never spoke of it. Elias felt the floor shift beneath him. The ledger had been abstract horror until this moment. Now it was genealogy. Bloodline. A direct line from those 14 crosses to the woman standing before him. Margaret lifted Nora's letter next. She read it slowly, lips moving in silent recitation. When she reached the end, "Truth moves like the river, it may be dammed, diverted, poisoned, but it rises. It floods. It finds the sea." She closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, they were dry, but the sorrow in them was ancient. Nora was literate in a world that made literacy a capital crime for people like us, she said. She taught herself under candle stubs and dirt floors. She turned quilt stitches into escape routes. She wrote this letter knowing it might never be read. That kind of courage doesn't shout. It endures. The conversation stretched into the evening. No raised voices. No accusations. Only the quiet, relentless examination of what had been done and what had been hidden. Margaret spoke of the ledger not as an anomaly but as the logical extension of a system that required meticulous bookkeeping to pretend it was moral. She spoke of the covenant not as betrayal by strangers but as the natural reflex of men who feared the truth would unravel the social order they had built their lives upon. And she spoke of the 14 crosses not as distant tragedy but as family. Elias listened, humbled. He had come expecting anger, instead he found clarity sharper than any blade he had ever carried. Eventually their talk circled back to the one loose thread Nora herself had left dangling: Dade. They returned to the ledger's final entry. Dade. Removed from service. Debt settled. October 1857. No flourish. No marginal note. Just the cold finality of a closed account. Margaret stared at the line as though it might speak if she waited long enough. Debt settled, she repeated softly. What debt? The debt of his silence? The debt of the lives he traded for a promise? Or simply the debt of being alive after he had served his purpose? They searched the parish deed books and manumission ledgers the next morning, carefully, discreetly. Nothing. No certificate of freedom issued to a man named Dade from the Voclain place. No bill of sale transferring him elsewhere. No grave marker in any cemetery, black or white. The official record ended with that single, ambiguous line. Elias rubbed his jaw. All this could have freed him quietly. Slipped him papers, sent him north, kept it off the books so no one else would demand the same. Margaret's gaze was steady. Or he could have decided that a man who would sell his own for freedom was too dangerous to leave breathing. Removed from service can mean many things. Most of them final. The ambiguity was worse than certainty. It left Dade suspended. Between victim and collaborator, between promised liberty and unmarked death, a final demonstration of Aldous Voclain's control. Even the betrayer's fate remained the master's private property. As dusk settled over the small house, Margaret lifted the last object from the chest, the bone hair comb, wrapped in its faded muslin square. She unwrapped it slowly. The comb was small, ivory pale, hand-carved with simple floral motifs along the spine. The teeth were uneven in places, marks of long use, but still strong. Someone had spent hours shaping it, polishing it with cloth and patience, turning cattle bone into something intimate and beautiful. Margaret held it to the lamplight. This belonged to one of them, she said. Florence, maybe. Or Clara. Or Nora herself. A woman who owned almost nothing still found a way to keep this. A daily ritual. A small claim on her own body in a world that claimed everything else. Elias watched her turn the comb over in her fingers. The gesture was tender, almost sacramental. How did it end up in the chest? He asked quietly. Why would Aldous keep something so personal, so incriminating, alongside the ledger and the letter? Margaret's eyes met his. Because he couldn't destroy it, she said. He buried the bodies. He silenced the witnesses. He forced the church to swear secrecy. But this little comb, he couldn't bring himself to burn it. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the need to possess even their most private things. Or maybe, deep down, he knew the truth couldn't be entirely erased. So he sealed it away, thinking time would do the rest of the work. She placed the comb back in its cloth with infinite care. But time didn't erase it, she continued. Time waited. And now we're here. Outside, cicadas swelled into their evening chorus. Inside, the documents lay quiet on the table, no longer secrets but summons. The chest had been opened. The graves had been named. A grandmother's survival had been traced to its hidden cost. And somewhere beneath the river mud, 14 crosses waited for the living to bear witness. The sacristy of St. Gideon's felt smaller now, the walls pressing inward as though the room itself recoiled from what it had sheltered. Elias Thorne and Margaret Ter sat across from each other at the scarred oak table, the cedar chest open between them like an exhumed coffin. The documents had been read, reread, handled until their edges softened. Yet one question refused to dissolve into the humid Louisiana air. How? How had Nora, watched every hour after the Riverbank betrayal, her every movement shadowed by overseers, managed to place her letter, her mother's comb, the map of 14 graves, inside a locked chest in the most private chamber of the White Church? The blueprints Elias had borrowed from the parish records lay spread before them. The sacristy appeared as a small, windowless rectangle tucked behind the altar, one door opening directly from the chancel, another a narrow service entrance rarely used except by the sexton on Mondays. Both were kept locked. An enslaved woman, especially one freshly punished for conspiracy, would no more have been allowed near the threshold than a fox near the henhouse. Elias traced the lines with a calloused finger. She wrote that she was kept apart. Watched. Always watched. She couldn't have slipped in here without someone seeing. Margaret studied the diagram with the same quiet intensity she brought to every historical puzzle. Then someone helped her. Someone with a key. Someone who believed her story deserved to survive. Elias shook his head slowly. The covenant shows 11 men swearing to bury it. If any of them helped her, they'd have been signing their own damnation twice over. Silence stretched between them, thick as cane syrup. Margaret spoke first, voice low. What if the helper was the one man who didn't need to sneak? Elias looked up sharply. What if Aldous Voclain himself put these things in the chest? The words hung there, obscene in their simplicity. Aldous Voclain, architect of the ledger, signer of the covenant, master who forced Dade to choose between freedom and betrayal. The same man who had every reason to burn Nora's letter to ash, yet who, instead, had wrapped her comb in muslin, folded her words with care, and locked them away in the one place no one would dare disturb for generations. Elias's breath left him in a slow hiss. Guilt? Or something colder, Margaret said. A need to keep the evidence. Not to destroy it, but to control even its survival. He couldn't let the courts have it. He couldn't let the newspapers print it. But perhaps he couldn't let it vanish entirely either. So he buried it here, where God could see it, where future eyes might one day find it, but where his own world could pretend it never existed. The theory was monstrous in its intimacy. It painted Aldous not as a simple monster, but as a man torn by a fracture he could neither heal nor ignore. He had priced human lives with elegant precision, yet he had kept the one document that named his hypocrisy. He had orchestrated silence, yet preserved a voice that broke it. He had owned Nora's body, yet allowed her words to endure. The comb rested on the table now, small and pale in the lamplight. Its carved flowers, simple, hopeful, seemed almost defiant. Whoever had made it had worked bone with no lathe, no fine tools, only patience and a blade. A daily act of selfhood in a life stripped of ownership. Margaret lifted it gently. He kept this too. Not as a trophy. As a relic. Something he couldn't bring himself to discard. Elias stared at the comb until his vision blurred. He sealed his own indictment in the house of God. And then he walked away and preached from that pulpit every Sunday. Margaret set the comb down. Perhaps that was the punishment he chose for himself. To live with the secret humming beneath every hymn. By late summer 1948, the initial shock had hardened into resolve. Reverend Voss, no longer the gentle shepherd he had been, gathered the senior deacons in the parsonage parlor one humid evening. No wives. No young men. Only the gray-haired bearers of the oldest names. He placed the documents on the table without preamble and let them read. The room filled with the sounds of turning pages, sharp intakes of breath, chairs scraping back. When they finished, no one spoke for a long time. 3 families, the Duboises, the Millers, the Fontenaux, were summoned individually in the weeks that followed. Private conversations behind locked doors. No accusations hurled. Only the quiet presentation of evidence and the unbearable knowledge that their grandfathers' signatures lay on the covenant. Within a month, all 3 families ceased attending St. Gideon's. They did not explain themselves. They simply vanished from the pews. Their empty places were noted, whispered over at church suppers, but never openly questioned. The congregation adjusted, as Southern communities so often did, by filling the silence with routine. The documents were not burned. Voss understood their weight too well now. He arranged, through discreet channels, for their transfer to the Louisiana Historical Association archives in New Orleans. They would be preserved under strict conditions, climate-controlled, catalogued, accessible to scholars but shielded from sensationalism. A place where truth could wait without igniting immediate fire. Margaret took her own path. She wrote a 40-page manuscript, measured, unflinching, placing Nora's letter and the ledger entries within the larger arc of enslavement in Ascension Parish. She named Florence as her grandmother, gave texture to the ledger's cold arithmetic, a woman who braided hair with gentle fingers, who slipped extra bread to hungry children, who carried the memory of a riverbank night for the rest of her days. Margaret deposited her account in the same archive, ensuring that Nora's voice would reach the world not only through plantation records but through the eyes of a descendant who still lived in the shadow of those fields. The parish never erected a marker. No apology was spoken from the pulpit. No public reckoning disturbed the Sunday morning calm. Yet something had shifted. The air in St. Gideon's felt thinner, the light through the stained glass less comforting. The renovated building stood straighter, but its foundations carried a new tremor. And Nora? She remained the final, unclosed wound. Elias and Margaret scoured every available record, 1860 census, tax rolls, manumission ledgers from 3 neighboring parishes, even the sparse plantation journals that survived the war. Nothing. After August 1857, Nora vanished from paper as completely as if she had stepped off the edge of the world. No sale. No death entry. No freedom paper. No grave. She slipped the net, Margaret said one evening as they sat on her porch watching fireflies rise over the cane. Maybe she escaped later, found another conductor, another boat. Maybe she lived to see emancipation in 65. Or maybe she died quietly on that same land, her passing too ordinary to note. Elias stared into the dark. Either way, she won the last silence. They couldn't even claim her ending. Margaret nodded. She gave them her beginning, her middle, her resistance. The ending? She kept that for herself. Years later, after Elias Thorne died in 1989 at 68, his daughter found a small leather journal among his tools. The final entry, dated 1987, read: "The worst thing about that chest wasn't the ledger or the letter. It was realizing the truth had been sitting under our feet the whole time. Every hymn, every prayer, every child baptized at that altar. And underneath it all, 14 crosses by the river. The past isn't gone. It's just waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to open the lid." The empty cedar chest eventually found a home in a New Orleans museum, displayed under soft light with a simple card. Cedar chest, St. Gideon's Church, Ascension Parish. Mid-19th century. Contained documents relating to an 1857 escape attempt on the Voclain Plantation. Donated 1951. Beside it, in an archival sleeve, rested Nora's letter and the bone comb, placed together as they had been found, text and talisman, voice and vessel. The story of the locked chest is not one of tidy justice or dramatic revelation. It is a meditation on complicity, on the slow poison of chosen silence, on the stubborn persistence of truth even when sealed in darkness. Nora did what she could with what she had. She learned to read in secret. She stitched messages into quilts. She wrote when writing could cost her life. She trusted that time, patient, relentless, would one day carry her words to open air. And time did. The river still flows past Ascension Parish, muddy and unhurried. The live oaks still drape Spanish moss like mourning veils. And somewhere in the quiet archives, a woman's voice, calm, precise, unbreakable, continues to speak. Waiting for the day we are finally ready to listen.